Hello and welcome to the Architecture of Change. I am your host, as ever, Leanne Meyer, and today we are talking about and examining a fundamental equation for system transformation. Now, I know when people say to know me is to love me, and to love me is also to know that I can get on my soapbox and also get stuck on a thing and can't let it go. And that's how this formula came about. This is my Leanne Meyer formula. Representation is the wrong way around. Representation plus power equals change. And this formula, and I talk about it in extent in my book, Closing the Gap, How to Include Black Women in Any Gender Equity Strategy. But above and beyond that, before it became part of my book, this became part of my, call it my soapbox portfolio. And it was kind of born out of an antipathy towards pushing representation as, in many cases, call this controversial if you will, but it was pushing representation as the be-all and end-all of change, with the focus on getting people into the room as the real important part. And it's not to say that the conversations above and beyond that were not reflective of the power piece, but the external conversations were never really talking about power in the sense that power is sorry, excuse me, power is seen as a dirty word. We don't like to talk about power. We don't like to talk about proximity to power very openly, maybe in closed rooms, but not in that space of we can't just be represented. We need to have power, because presence is decoration and power is change. And we know that, and we continue to see in so many ways, whether it's in AI and biased algorithms, whether it's in TikTok and the lack of promotion of Black creators' content, whether you see it we see what the lack of representation does over and over again, because we see it in the things we consume. We see it in the financial aspects. We see it, continuously, that it's something that we can't any longer be afraid to interact with as a concept. We can't be afraid to discuss this piece around power. Now, obviously, there's this part around, power in numbers, which is absolutely critical, because power in numbers allows us to bring another opinion and have that opinion also affirmed. But the downside is that we still know, let's just take women. You can still have 3 women in a room, but those 3 opinions can still be outweighed by the opinion of one man, right? Because the value of his word, and I spoke about this in the very first series, the value of a woman's word, means that in a lot of cases, even with numbers, we are still not getting the change, because the value of a woman's word is not equal to the value of a man's word. Therefore, even if there are 3 women, should an opinion be contradicted by one man, we still end up in the same place. And this is why we have to explore all of the elements that have to work together to create systems transformation, but also genuine transformation, including the power piece, which makes, to be quite honest, which makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable, because the portrayal of women who are open about wanting power and seeking power becomes packaged in a villainous stereotype, megalomaniac, not a very nice person, and so on and so forth. And it's a very difficult one because there are so many mechanisms that try to dissuade not just women, but dissuade minoritized and marginalized groups to want to have power rather than to want to be proximate to power. And they're packaged in negative stereotypes. And we can, and this is not to say that it's always the case, but a lot of times a woman who is after power and also money is called, money hungry. It moves from being ambitious. There's something spurious about her personality. There must be something not right with her. Whereas when a man says he wants power, it's very much part of his so-called, in pseudoscience, his genetic makeup to want power in a way that people don't give women and minoritized and marginalized groups the same grace. Because it is very clear that representation and this power part is the bit that drives change, not proximity to power, excuse me, but actually having the power is where we get the real the real driving force behind things having a different outcome. And I think this is I also talk about this in my book, but this is in many cases like the representation trap, because a lot of times what is not seen is a lot of I'm going to call them the representative groups for any group, is that externally the misconception is that being in the room equates to having a voice, which it rarely does. Presence versus influence. Sometimes the presence is given for the optics, but not for change. And this is the part of this is always the difficult bit to navigate, because it's how do you then get to the power? How do you get there so that you have power to create change? And I thought about this long and hard. And part of it is, saying before you get power, you have to be proximate to power. That is very true. And that still remains the case. So this is not me saying, although I'm on my soapbox, this is not me saying that representation is wrong and being in the room is, the problem, and it's not. It's the first step. So how do we turn being in the room to having some of the power to drive change? Because you have to be proximate to power to be able to actually get to the point where you have it. And a lot of times we know that there is the invisible barrier between proximate and actually having the real thing. And on the one hand, we can say that power is never given, it's taken. And that's in a general revolutionary coup perspective. But in organizations and in a lot of other places, part of it is given, but it's also given on a quid pro quo basis, right? And the question becomes, what is it that I have to negotiate with, and what is it that I have to give? Just like I spoke about in the episode on the evolution of modern leadership, if people with power believe you're going to completely change everything that they've done, they will not give you any power. It just won't happen. If everything that's made them money and generated their success, and you're saying in order for that to keep going, or in order for us to make change, we have to dismantle all of that, that is not going to get you a yes. And sometimes this is the challenge around negotiating power, is that it is often a negotiation. If it's going to be, it's often a negotiation if it's with people who are reasonable. The other side of getting power, that is the side that we will not discuss, is the side of hostility and all things that are unethical, which still happens, but this is not the side of life that I exist on. It's how do we move representation into being, or representatives into being power holders, so that they can drive change within organizations, within, listen, it can also be within families. It's not always it's about the principle rather than necessarily always being at that place of having to apply it kind of very, very specifically. It's the principles underlying that. And I guess this is where sometimes we have to sit down and consider who is really making the decision and what are they trying to get to? Because the phrase still holds true, right? There's more than one way to skin a cat. It's not a very pleasant phrase, but okay. There's more than one way to skin a cat. And it's no different with people in power. What is it that they're trying to achieve? And can they only achieve it this way? And do they need to go about it this way? Or is there another way that we can come up with together that serves many instead of serving the very few? Because usually this is what it's about, right? It serves the shareholders. It serves the 1%. It serves the exco team, but it doesn't serve the vast majority of employees. It doesn't serve middle management. It doesn't serve society. And I think these are the questions, it's the question of, hey, where is the power? B, what is the time frame? Because a lot of times, and in the course of this series of architecture of change, a lot of things are pushed through quickly to achieve something quickly, and protection and protecting people falls by the wayside. And a part of a lot of power dynamics are a distancing. There's a huge distance between those in power and those who feel the effects of said power. So all the decisions that are made from a theoretical basis, because there's always going to be, to a certain extent, an ethical question around power. And this is why, as we move into increasing representation, numbers are a protection in helping maintain a level of groundedness. Because it's very easy to be swayed by power and power dynamics and the intoxication of, I am making change here, but not necessarily following through as to where the change is going to happen. There's something very intoxicating about that can lead away from where you originally started. And this is why representation in numbers is important, because if you have the same values, it allows you to stay grounded and focused on the change that you are trying to create. Because sometimes the other part about it is that, I put here representation power equals change based on the assumption that the change is positive, right? Change is not always positive. And somehow, and sometimes what happens is, where there is not protection in numbers, those who are in the space of representation do get power, but they are influenced away from making the changes that they originally wanted to. So the change does happen, but it does not have the positive impact on the community as was intended, because they have been distracted away from their goals with the promises of more and more and more and more. Because sometimes we don't talk about the downsides of when somebody does get their power and then they lose their values, which is also a real challenge. as I said, the assumption of the equation is a positive one, but the reality is that there's not always a positive outcome. Sometimes there is this negative outcome, the loss of values. And in many cases, I think the power in numbers, as I said before, the power in numbers is sometimes not even about, oh, we've got more people here so that people can, there's an affirmation of ideas. It provides a level of community and grounding to ensure that the positive change that was meant to happen continues to happen as per the plan. Because sometimes we don't think about that. We don't think about what do we do when we get there, because a lot of the times we're fighting to get there. We spend so much time fighting to get there that we don't necessarily think about what could be a lure, excuse me, away from my values. What could change the way that I interact with my original goals, the reason why I wanted to be in this room, the kinds of changes I wanted to make when I got to this room. Because this is the other side, right? What did they say? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, I think is the phrase. And sometimes these are the questions we have to ask ourselves in the pursuit of wanting to be the person in the room. If I get the power that I need to create change, have I truly considered the impact of that and what I will do when it's there? Because as you receive power, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are still the ultimate decision maker, right? Power is still used to manipulate. And this is how sometimes when you're the lonely only and you're given an element of power, you sometimes veer away from your values because the lure is, let them do this little bit while we do all of this. And you still think you're creating change. You are creating change, but you're not creating it in the way you envisaged. But it is very, very limited. And once again, it's understanding, when you're in those rooms and you get to that room, it's not always about jumping in and trying to prove your worth while you're in that room. It's around, how can I understand who holds the real power? What are their interests? Where are they trying to get to? And can I support that and support where I am trying to create positive, emphasis on that, positive change? Because in a lot of cases, I always think about, how can you recognize where power is? And you can always recognize where power is, through the power to veto. And more specifically, and I'll give an example. Have you ever been in a situation where you've been in a room with, and when I say influence, I mean even with friendship groups, right? Where you've been in a room, let's just say 10 friends in a room, you want to decide on a restaurant. 9 people say, yeah, we want to go here. One person says, no, we don't. No, I don't want to go there. Here is better. And all the other friends agree. That is where the influence and the power is. Now, on the outside, that situation just looks like, oh yeah, do you know what? It was a better idea, etc., etc. But that's where the power is. And that's usually how you get to see who holds sway and who holds influence. By, if this one person says no against a group and that person manages to get their own way, that is the influence holder. That is the power holder. And by people's decisions, you can usually tell, excuse me, the things they agree to, the things they disagree with, is a really good indicator as to how and where your barriers to create positive change may indeed lie. And it's It's an interesting one because we should, and if you want to have more conversations about this, like, I'm definitely up for these kinds of conversations because I think they're really important, because these kinds of conversations underscore this whole topic of architecture of change, understanding systems, and within those systems, understanding key players. And power holders are always key players. Um, and being able to recognize those tells are really important. Being able to recognize, how can I create positive change here, when I am in the true sense of the word, in the minority in this group, whether it's from opinion, whether it's from gender, whether it's from race and ethnicity, heritage, etc., etc. But when I am the minority in this group for many different reasons, how can I still create the change that I want to? And it's not just by maintaining power, it's by understanding the powers that also be. That's the part of that's the power piece, and the development of the power piece for me in this equation that I have definitely thought about since the publication of my book in 2023. I said it with a question mark at the end. I'm still confused with the years. It's 2025 now. But yeah, that's been the development, the evolution, the equity evolution in my own thinking, which, back when I was writing my book, it was very much focused on the having of power. But I hadn't gone myself into the depths, as it were, of needing to fully understand the dynamics of power in this way. It was definitely about the acquisition of power and needing to understand that the powers that be have it, but it's who has it, how do we recognize that they have it, and how do we recognize their interests in order to be able to get to where we want to be, to make positive change. How do we maintain our values once we're given that said power? And how do we ensure that we're not being manipulated and being given a crumb instead of a slice of cake to keep us happy? But because we're so happy with the crumb, we lose sight of the slice, and we lose sight of the cake. And we're so focused on eating this thing, we've no longer looked at what's being apportioned and given, in different places and spaces. Yeah, and that's I would say that's the real job. And I'm thinking out loud, which is, understanding how power works means you understand how it's built, how it's constructed, how it moves. Understanding influence, understanding the people who currently have it, understanding the gap between those who have it and those who do not. Understanding that if you are in those rooms, you will need support, not only for numbers and visuals, but you will also need support in community to support your values. Because without that, it makes it very, very difficult to create lasting change, meaningful change. But also, I think everybody comes to a point where, well, not everybody, but for generalization's sake, everybody comes to that point where they have that reckoning with their own values, right? Have I deviated too far away from my values? And have I, in the improvement of my own life situation, et cetera, continue to maintain those values? Or have I been persuaded to move away from them? Because what has consumed me has no longer been collective positive change, it's been individual positive change, and I've lost sight of what I was trying to do. Because ultimately, in wanting to be part of a representative group to create positive change for a community, um, you have to recognize, or in wanting to do that, part of the recognition is that this is bigger than you, and your goals aren't just for you as the individual, but your goals are there for a broader, wider purpose. And that has to still be front and center. So my final note is, there is so much complexity around power and being a representative in spaces of power. But this is why it's so important to continue to question and, self-interrogate as much as observe and interrogate the situation, to ensure that the values that you have are maintained, but that sometimes presence and silence can be as much of a strategy as you begin to learn to navigate those spaces before you can really get to grips with what power is and what power means. So thank you so much once again for taking the time. And I wish you a wonderful afternoon. And don't forget to continue architecting change, because today's design is tomorrow's reality.